Yeah, it's wild.
Wow.
Can't see a thing.
And President Trump ousting Federal Reserve Governor Lisa Cook. He's accusing her of mortgage fraud, and the move is described as unprecedented. Max Gordon is live at the White House with more. Hi, Max. Good morning.
Hey there, Dana. Well, unprecedented is right. This is the first time in history that a president has attempted to remove a sitting Federal Reserve governor. President Trump accusing Fed Reserve Governor Lisa Cook of lying on mortgage forms. Cook is accused of claiming in the span of 2 weeks to live in two different primary residences in two different states. One, a house in Michigan, the other, a condo in Georgia. Yesterday, President Trump posted a letter on Truth Social addressed to Lisa Cook informing her that she was being fired, reading in part, "At minimum, the conduct at issue exhibits the sort of gross negligence in financial transactions that calls into question your competence and trustworthiness as a financial regulator." Cook released a statement of her own saying President Trump purported to fire me for cause when no cause exists under law and he has no authority to do so. I will not resign. I will continue to carry out my duties to help the American economy as I've been doing since 2022. Currently, Cook has not been charged with a crime. As a Fed governor, Cook is a voting member of the Federal Open Market Committee, which makes interest rate decisions. President Trump has repeatedly called on the Federal Reserve to cut interest rates to boost the economy and lower the cost of servicing the national debt.
Boy, 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 boy. So we got to talk about what I believe to be the biggest news of the day, probably the biggest news of the week, involving Federal Reserve Governor Lisa Cook, who is facing allegations of mortgage fraud. And she was just fired by President Trump. I'll put it this way. He declared that he fired her for cause, due to the allegations of mortgage fraud. Now, Ms. Lisa Cook is saying that the president cannot fire her and that she is not going anywhere and that she's going to sue the administration and fight to stay in her job. Now, I want to talk about this because, again, this is kind of a big deal. It's a really big deal. And you know it's a big deal because the mainstream liberal media, they're freaking out over this, claiming that this is an attack on the quote-unquote independence of the Fed, as if the Fed is actually independent. But again, that is the propaganda. That is the narrative that they're pushing in the mainstream liberal media. Again, as they freak out and they fume and they're upset over President Trump firing this woman for alleged mortgage fraud. So without further ado, roll the clip.
Donald Trump just tried to fire Lisa Cook, who is the first black woman to serve on the Federal Reserve Board, quote, effective immediately. In the face of baseless allegations made by the Trump administration, Cook said last week that she had no intention of being bullied and pledged to gather accurate information to answer any legitimate questions and provide the facts. Let's be very clear. Since Donald Trump came back into office, he has tried any way he can to chip away at the Federal Reserve's independence. And this has truly been in an attempt to get to the rock bottom interest rates that he really desires to have, apparently by any means necessary.
The Supreme Court in Trump versus Wilcox earlier this year made it very clear that the Federal Reserve is a quasi-private entity that is not subject to the whims and wiles, effectively saying, of the President of the United States. They are an independent body. So help us understand why the President thinks that he can just summarily fire a Fed board member in the face of the fact that this body relates its history back to the early days of the founding of this country, in which very bright lines, Alexander Hamilton, Mr. President, you may recall him. We were talking about Hamilton earlier today. Very bright lines were drawn with respect to the banking relationship between the Reserve and the Fed and the government.
That's right. The Fed is analogized to the first bank of the United States in the first Congress. So it informs our understanding of the Constitution. The second bank of the United States, which was based on the first bank. This isn't like the other cases which are pending final disposition at Democracy Defenders Fund. We're litigating some of them about the extent of the president's firing power, and the Supreme Court said so in the Gwen Wilcox case, that the Fed is different. But Donald Trump doesn't care about the Constitution. He doesn't care that Congress has said you can only fire somebody for cause. He doesn't care that he has no cause here. This is based on a tweet by one of his most sharp partisans, Bill Pulte, who's in charge of the federal agency dealing with mortgages. This is irrelevant to him. You have somebody in the White House who himself convicted felon, 34 counts. No wonder the federal courts have shot him down 200 times for illegal actions. This is another one. And you know what? Remember, can I have that letter?
Sure.
This is Donald Trump's letter. Do you know what Lisa Cook should do? What Nancy Pelosi did. She should tear that letter. Now you'll need to tape it for the rest of the segment. That letter is worthless.
Ali, I want to bring you in here, my friend, because...
Yeah, see, you seen that, you heard that. Okay, the mainstream liberal media, full-blown panic, right? They're in full-blown panic over this, and we're going to react to more of the panic. But I just want you guys to notice how they're basically letting you know that this is a black woman, right? President Trump is attacking a black woman, right? Because apparently you're not supposed to hold black women accountable, right? Black women can never be held accountable for their actions, right? When they commit crimes, right? When they falsify their mortgage documents, oh, you can't hold them accountable. But the white man, President Trump, he should be held accountable, right? Which is essentially the argument of MSNBC, right? Their propagandists always bringing up the Alvin Bragg case, the hush money case, the conviction there, when it's like, well, again, that was trumped up political persecution, right? And for whatever reason, the left thinks that it's okay when it's done to Trump, but when other people, Democrats, are being held accountable, now all of a sudden, oh, well, it's not okay, right? You can't hold him accountable. What I do know is that, again, if this was a Republican, okay, the mainstream liberal media would say that this is 100% legit, right? And that hey, nobody's above the law. Everybody has to be held accountable. But because of a Democrat, they want to cry foul. So without further ado, let's go ahead and react to the administration, what the administration is saying about firing this woman.
Secretary, I do need to pivot to a different question around Lisa Cook, governor at the Fed, who has been fired by the president for cause. She says she's not going and that he doesn't have the authority to do such a thing. You're obviously in the administration, close to the president, also understand how the wheels of just the machinery of the government work. Who pays her paycheck, for example? Is that something that has to come directly from the Fed? Is that something that Chair Powell will have to turn off, if you will? Does she have a pass to get into the building as somebody turns on or turns off? And who does that?
So, yeah, I don't know the details of who has her paycheck or not. But the issue is a federal government, a governor of the Federal Reserve, literally signs her name and commits mortgage fraud, right? It's alleged that she's committed mortgage fraud, and she says, I'm not going anywhere. Well, the crook always says, I'm not going anywhere. And why would anybody defend that? The real question should be, did she commit mortgage fraud, yes or no? And if you did commit mortgage fraud, please get out of the federal government, get out of the seat of the governor of the Federal Reserve, and go away. You don't deserve to be there if you've committed mortgage fraud. Right? It's black and white. If you've committed mortgage fraud, you shouldn't be a governor of the Federal Reserve.
This is a domino effect. One of the reasons I'm asking you this question about who needs to turn off her badge or turn off her paycheck is if the answer is that ultimately Chair Powell is the one responsible for that and he chooses not to, then the secondary question becomes, does the president try to fire him for cause?
Well, these are all what-if scenarios. The answer is the Department of Justice will go take this on and deal with this. But the fact is, if this woman committed mortgage fraud, she should be respectful to the United States of America, to the Federal Reserve, where she says she cared about them, and she should go off into the sunset and hope to God the police don't follow her, right? Mortgage fraud is a serious crime. We can't have mortgage fraud in America, and you surely can't have it for your leaders. I mean, imagine anyone in the cabinet who did this. You guys would be calling for their head. This woman should go away if she's committed the mortgage fraud, and those signatures sure as heck look like hers.
Yeah, so if this was a Republican, there's no doubt. If a Democrat was in office, right, was president of the United States, and this was a Republican that did this, there's no doubt that the mainstream liberal media would be supporting it, right? They would say this is 100% legit. Okay, you're a right-wing conspiracy theorist if you claim that this is political persecution, right? This is the president weaponizing the government to go after his political opponents or whatever, right? This is what they would say. okay? But because it's Trump, and you have a woman who was appointed by Biden, right? Who's typically a dove, right? Typically, she is in favor of lowering interest rates, right? Except now that Trump is in office, right? Now that Trump is in office, all of a sudden she's a hawk, right? Which again, that goes against this narrative that President Trump is challenging the independence of the Fed, right? As if the Fed is actually independent. The Fed is not independent, right? Let's be real. Everybody knows this. This is why you're not seeing much of a market reaction from this, and we're going to get into that a little bit further in the video. But my point is that this woman made this allegation. The federal government, right? The Trump administration, he does have the right to fire her for cause. Now, what is defined as for cause? Maybe that's up to the courts to decide. But let's actually make this a little bit simpler, okay? Because a lot of people are saying, well, she needs due process. And I'm like, well, if you look at the private sector, right? If a company believes that you committed a crime, right? Whether it be on the job, off the job, or whatever, they don't have to wait until you go through all of the due process in the court of law, right? The criminal investigation, in order to decide that, you know what, it's better for us to part ways while this individual goes through this process, this investigation. It happens all the time. But when it's done by the government, all of a sudden it's a problem, right? It's an issue, okay? But in the private sector, this happens all the time, right? People face allegations of wrongdoing, okay? And companies decide that, hey, you know what? We've done our own due diligence on this, and we want to let this individual go. It happens. I don't see what is different about that, right? And what is happening with this. The Trump administration has done their due diligence on this. They say, hey, this woman, we believe, committed mortgage fraud. Now, again, in regards to the criminal investigation, yeah, she's going to get due process from the DOJ, but we're talking about her job. We're talking about her actual employment, right? Her employer, right, has decided that, you've done this, and we want to let you go while this investigation is ongoing. Again, happens all the time in the private sector. For whatever reason, when the government does it, right, when the Trump administration does it, oh, this is terrible, right? This is terrible. Now, usually, we've seen situations before in the past where members of the Fed who are accused of wrongdoing, like, for example, insider trading. There was an insider trading scandal that happened a few years ago. And, you know, the person stepped down, right? They resigned, and that's typically what happens. But in this woman's case, she's determined to not go anywhere, right? To let the president know that she has more power than him. And, that is going to end up in a court battle that probably needs to happen, right? Because I think that we should figure out how much power does the executive branch have over the Federal Reserve, right? Like, I mean, are we really going to just let the Federal Reserve not be accountable to anybody, right? Anybody at all, right? You think that's a good idea to not have any accountability to voters, okay, to the taxpayer? Nah, I don't think that an institution with that much influence, right, should be completely unaccountable to taxpayers, which, again, is what the mainstream liberal media and these woke economists are essentially arguing for. So without further ado, let's get into it.
The Dow off by 60 points, and welcome back to Money Movers on CNBC. President Trump moving to fire Federal Reserve Governor Lisa Cook. It's his latest threat against Fed independence. Joining us now, former Fed Governor Frederick Mishkin and former acting chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, Tomas Philipson. Gentlemen, good to see you today. The chief economist for New Century Advisors, Claudia Sahm, sent out a pretty attention-getting post on X. She says, if we could pull this up now, do not forget, it's about control of the Fed. This is a very dark day. Rick, is it?
Yeah, sure it is. This is just part of a whole process of economic policies that keep on getting more extreme. There's a tremendous amount of research and experience that says independent central banks do a better job at achieving the objectives that governments actually set for them, which is keeping inflation low and maximizing employment. This is just going one step further. I don't think there's much new here. Trump has been attacking the Fed in very strong ways, talked about firing Powell, but backed off. Now he's got an opening because of this situation with Lisa Cook's mortgages. But it's all part of a pattern here to actually reduce the independence of the Fed. And to be honest, this is exactly what Trump should not want to have happen, because it's going to lead to higher interest rates.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I necessarily agree with that argument, right? In the sense that is going to lead to higher interest rates, because ultimately at the end of the day, I don't think the market is stupid enough to believe that the Fed is independent. I mean, if you look at some of the reactions here, the 10-year Treasury is down on the day, right? If this was such a big deal, right? If this was so terrible, oh my God, yield should be spiking, right? Yield should be spiking like crazy if this was the threat that these people are claiming, right? Oh good God, the Fed is not independent anymore, right? If that's the case, then again, yield should be spiking like crazy, okay? People should be selling hard, right? But again, we're not seeing that today in the markets. Even when it comes to the dollar index, again, still really not seeing that much a reaction to it. So again, there's a very big difference between the market reaction, okay, and the reaction that you're seeing in the media. And again, the reason why is because smart money knows that the Fed is not really independent, right? This idea that they're independent is silly. It's nonsense. They've already priced in the fact that there's probably going to be rate cuts. The rate cuts are going to happen regardless of President Trump pressuring them, right? Because ultimately there is data to suggest that, hey, you know what? Maybe, just maybe, the Fed is misguided when it comes to some of their goals, right? And their policy outlook moving forward into the future. And President Trump firing this woman is not going to make or break that, right? It's not going to change the dynamics of the Fed as a whole. But I do think that we should figure out exactly how much authority does the president have over the Fed, okay, and whether or not he can fire Fed governors, okay, and if this reason is a good reason. Like, I just think from the perspective of working all of this stuff out, I think that it makes sense to take a wait-and-see approach, right, in regards to what's actually going to happen here.
Because the loss of credibility of the Fed, of the central bank, leads to higher expectations of inflation and therefore higher interest rates. So it's not actually in Trump's interest, but you know, this is what he's doing. What can I say?
Do you think that it's also like it's almost like reverse psychology, that the more, I mean, we see this with teenagers and parenting, right? The more you try to crack down and get them to do what you want them to do, the more resistance there is. Do you think that it could have just a reverse course, that unless there's an overwhelming reason to say cut rates, the Fed might insist on demonstrating its independence by refusing to do so?
Yeah, I actually talked about this earlier, that even before this particular episode, that the threat to Fed's independence are making them have a little bit higher bar on lowering interest rates. So again, this is not achieving what Trump seems to want, but this is what he's doing. And, you know, I hate to compare the Fed to teenagers, but actually it's appropriate when you have to worry about your credibility, that if you're being bullied, you have to stand up to them or it gets worse.
Well, see, again, what this dude is admitting, right, and I don't think he's smart enough to realize he's admitting this, which is that, again, the Fed is political, right? If you're telling me that the Fed is increasing their bar to lower interest rates because of what the president is saying, then you're saying that the Fed is political, right? They're acting in a political way. Well, they're acting that way to preserve their independence. Well, that should be irrelevant to whether or not they're actually independent, right? The illusion of independence, right? The appearance of independence is actually not as important as being independent. If the president says, hey, interest rates should be lowered, and the Fed agrees with that, right, then they shouldn't be setting a higher bar, or they should not be refusing to do it because they want to look independent, right? They should just do it because they're independent, and it doesn't matter what the president says. But again, these people are admitting out loud that the Fed ain't really independent because apparently they're not lowering interest rates because they hate Trump, right? They don't like Trump, which again is essentially what this guy is saying, okay? But I don't think he's smart enough to realize that that's what he's saying. Again, that's why you're not seeing the market reaction to this that equals, that matches the panic in the media, right? Because everybody knows that this idea that the Fed is quote unquote independent is nonsense.
Tomas, from your perspective, when you're looking at truly the pressure that is being applied to the Fed right now, and the allegation that there may have been malfeasance when it came to this mortgage application, how should the Federal Reserve respond?
I mean, I'm not going to take a stand on the legal issues. I'm an economist, so whether alleged fraud is a cause that the president can use to fire someone is not really my expertise. I think it's poorly handled. by the White House doing it this way. On the other hand, I think there's a theme here, which I think is something that's worth thinking about, which is agencies many times don't perform. BLS surveys have gone very poorly in terms of response rates, etc. And you can think the woman who ran it is the nicest person on the planet, but in the private sector, if you hire a salesperson and sale goes down, you fire them or replace them. I think that's similar to the Fed. Fed has not reached its own goal of 2% in stemming inflation. They claim taxes or tariffs are inflationary, which tariffs are not, essentially, because inflation is economy-wide price increases. Tariffs might hit certain tariffs goods, but then other goods will have less money to spend on them. And also the tariff revenue is 200 or 300 billion, which is 1% of overall consumption driving CPI. So they're out to lunch on a lot of issues. In fact, you can argue that the Fed was it's the agency we have for price stability, but it's also the agency that caused price instability during COVID with a massive money supply increase they generated, essentially. So there is a legit argument here, I think. How do you control poorly performing agencies? That's, I think, is the underlying theme here. And just saying that any agency should be immune to being controlled for poor performance, I also think is not healthy. This execution of doing it, I don't think is the right way, but I think it's a bigger debate. How do you control bad agencies?
Yeah, I think that, honestly, this is a pretty neutral, spot-on take, right? I'm not necessarily a fan of the way it's being done either. But if we're, again, having a real conversation here, the Fed ain't really independent, right? They're not immune from political persuasion, right? Okay, I mean, we saw Jerome Powell decide to lower interest rates right before the election, even though conditions back then were less favorable to an interest rate decrease than they are right now, right? And he did that right before the election, a huge drop, okay? Now, what this guy is also bringing up, which I think is a great point, is that, well, look at that job performance. When inflation got up to, 9%, the Feds only raised the interest rates up to 5, 6, right? Which, I mean, they didn't even raise it higher than inflation itself. Which I would argue is part of the reason why we're still dealing with inflation, is because the Feds were too late when inflation actually was surging, okay, which is not right now, right? But when it actually was surging under the Biden administration, they were way too late to increase interest rates. They were way too late to respond, which again, I think is one of the reasons why we're still dealing with it today. Okay, it's the residuals of the Fed not acting early enough and not acting strong enough. So again, if you look at their actual job performance, I think that there are real questions about whether or not they're doing a good job. And if you're not doing a good job, right, whether that be with the Fed, okay, or whether that be with the Bureau of Labor Statistics, when you talk about releasing jobs reports that are off by 90%, at some point, somebody has to be held accountable for bad performance, right? If you're not performing your job well, you have to be held accountable. But for whatever reason, this is a very controversial and foreign concept when we apply it to our government. To the private sector, everybody accepts that, if you have bad performance, or put it this way, if there is good reason to believe that you committed a crime, regardless of whether or not you're guilty or not guilty, a company has the right to say, you know what, we want to let you go, right? We're going to let you go, okay, for bad performance or for, being credibly accused of a crime or whatever. And I'm not saying it's necessarily right, but I'm just saying we accept that in the private sector. But in the public sector, for whatever reason, we don't accept that at all. You can't fire any bureaucrat for any reason, right? You can't fire them for poor job performance. You can't fire them for not managing the economy well. You can't fire them for any of that stuff, right? You can't fire them for alleged mortgage fraud. Like that is where we're at. Trump can't do anything, right? Trump can't do anything without these people boohoo, whining, and crying. And again, when people ask questions about why is our government so inefficient, why is our government such a failure, well, it's because of stuff like this. Nobody's ever held accountable. Apparently, you're allowed to get in these jobs and you can, allegedly commit mortgage fraud, right? You can do a bad job at producing statistics, okay, about the economy and managing the economy. You can do all these things, bad job, terrible job. But apparently you can't be fired for it, right? You can never be held accountable. And I think there is something to be said about accountability. And that's why I think that at the very least, okay, we're going to have a court battle, a legal battle over how much accountability does the Fed have, okay? How much can the president hold the Fed accountable? And I think that's a important conversation to have and to work out these issues, right? Because I don't think it's a good idea to have an institution as powerful as the Fed that has as much influence on the economy as the Fed not have any accountability at all, zero, none, right, to the people, right, to taxpayers. That to me just doesn't sound right? But hey, let me know what you guys think. Make sure you like, comment, and subscribe. Most importantly, share a Black conservative perspective. Peace.